Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. This episode is a discussion over the C2 of the Northern Navies Initiative and the Joint Expeditionary Force with Ed Arnold from the D Group. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware Suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
In April 2026, the UK's Naval Chief General Gwyn Jenkins announced a new formation, the Northern Group of Navies. 10 Scandinavian and Baltic states, plus the UK, had agreed to come together to form a multinational maritime force designed to enhance the security of Northern Europe, the North Atlantic, and the High North. Interestingly, they're all NATO states, right? And all members of the Joint Expeditionary Force. So maybe it's an alliance within an alliance. The grouping centres on defending the open sea border with Russia, particularly the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, known as the GI-UK gap, and the surrounding waters where Russian activity has, according to the UK government, increased by 30% over the past 2 years. So what do we know about this new, or maybe it's not so new, idea? Well, the initiative seeks to create a hybrid fleet with increased mass, survivability and lethality, all buzzwords straight from the military neophilia Bible. It's designed to act as a more rapid response capability in a crisis compared to NATO's larger, slower force structures. The plan plans to share common digital networks, logistics and ammunition stockpiles. Now, all this sounds great, particularly for the UK. A lack of Royal Navy units until 2035 means that the security of the UK homeland from Russian attack depends on others who've thought ahead and have the capability. What is less clear is why the UK is the framework nation. Can the other 9 members of this initiative be so impressed with an underpowered aircraft carrier they're blind to what the UK has done in terms of divesting itself of platforms in order to operate a rather underwhelming and unreliable 20th century power projection capability? More importantly for us, the UK position in this concept is to lead and command, which left me wondering, what makes the UK the right country to lead and command this group? And why is Northwood, outside London, the place to do it from? So to my guest today, I wanted to get to the bottom of command and control areas of this conundrum. That involves going back to the core organisation from which this idea is based, the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. Ed Arnold has been covering the JEF since its inception and has a better understanding of it than almost anyone else I know. Ed is no simple cheerleader though. He's been highly critical of it, as he has been in lauding its successes. Ed himself is now a strategy consultant and programme director of the D Group's National Security Working Group. He's experienced across the public and private sector, including within consulting, intelligence and academia. Notably, Ed was previously a British Army officer of an infantry bias. His military career was primarily spent overseas, including deployments in Afghanistan and East Africa, and a posting at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe during the 2014 Ukraine crisis. Ed, welcome to the show. Hard to believe I haven't had a reason to get you on before now. But can we start with the basics of this? The Joint Expeditionary Force, for those not aware of what it is, how does this new concept differ from whatever the JEF is?
Well, I think it's a consequence really of where the JEF is now that it's 12 years since its inception, really. And I think the genesis of the JEF was always as a defence framework. It was about initially the hard-won operational experience in Afghanistan. So a lot of the JEF nations were actually under UK command. And there was a reason why we should build on this if we can. Also, in terms of European capabilities and really deficiencies in Libya when the US wanted to lead from the back. So the JEF was something that the UK was thinking about anyway, but then the membership and certainly the regional specialisation of the JEF in Northern Europe sort of just came together quite naturally, actually. And it evolved and it had a couple of new members, most notably Finland and Sweden. So it was sort of bridging the EU as well in sort of 2017, 2018. And then the JEF really sort of suddenly had this political dimension as Russia invaded in 2022. So the first leaders' call was the day after the invasion, which was virtual. And then they had sort of another 3 meetings that year. And then that's sort of come into the battle rhythm of it now. So you have yearly leaders' meetings. You also have national security advisors meetings, PermSec meetings, defence ministers. We've just had a meeting of attorneys general of the GEF. So it started to get this sort of political layer as well. But actually what you've now seen in the last, I'd say, 18 months really, and actually in terms of the change of government in the UK, that political level has just not been invested in. It is really underpowered. It is not meeting what the GF could become. So I think this new concept within it in terms of Northern Navies is kind of getting the GF back to basics, which is a defence framework, operational level, maritime flavour, and actually trying to get something out of it, because there's a bit of a danger of it atrophying if the political level sort of starts to fail. And all of that development that has happened in 2014, obviously the UK doesn't want to lose. So I see this as almost the personal mission of the First Sea Lord to get GEF back into some form that can actually build momentum again and start to really be valuable to the members individually, but also collectively, and then also to NATO.
The GEF and their partners there have done some really impressive things, particularly in the land space. There's been joint purchases, there's been sharing of logistics, there's local states of force agreements. And if you look at the sort of amphibious discussions and work they've been doing, the mine warfare work they've been doing, particularly in the Baltic, and then you talk about the army and the fires, there seems to have been quite a concentration on niche areas inside the GEF, including exercises, but nothing bigger, broader. Is that right, or is that just a perception problem?
No, I think the main problem with the GEF, which again I think is absolutely time to articulate given the broader changes in European security, is really truly what is the GEF for? Now, the issue is, if you're going to say that you're in full complementarity to NATO, you almost take the sort of GEF strategy away. The way I see it is you have Article 3 national defence plans, then you have NATO and the regional plans up to including Article 5. You sort of have GEF, and the language that they use is coherence. So it's not always about command, it is about coherence and getting more out of combined Article 3. So it makes logical sense. But actually, the problem is that the GEF becomes a bit of a gap filler because NATO is not a static organisation and the national defence plans are not static. So if you're an organisation that fills in the gaps and those gaps change, it can be quite difficult to articulate, particularly as now that all states or all members are now NATO members as well. So actually, fairly recently, the GEF, in terms of activity, was saying, well, it's supporting a NATO operation. And then you sort of logically like, well, why is the GEF supporting a NATO operation in the Baltic when there's a NATO operation in the Baltic? It doesn't quite match. So I think this is where the GEF has a bit of a problem, that it's still not fully exactly clear where its value is. And it has its detractors as well. Now, in order to combat that, you'd expect the UK to move through to articulating that. And just thus far, it really hasn't. I think one of the things that the GEF is very good at and has been historically is its flexibility, because it's a 1+1 mechanism. It's not unanimous decision making like almost all other frameworks within European security. So actually, it had, before its interim operating capability, it had its first deployment in terms of West Africa and Ebola in 2014, which again, compare it with other European security frameworks, is unheard of. And the view was always, well, the GEF can act while NATO thinks. You're like, okay, great. But now NATO is actually changing. So the Allied Reaction Force now, that has now been delegated authority to Saka. So Saka doesn't have to go to the NAC to deploy the Allied Response Force. He can just do it. And then also a lot of what you saw in the Baltics since the end of 24 was actually that the GEF should probably have stood up and responded to that more forcefully, chose not to for a variety of reasons, and we can get into that. So actually NATO stood up Baltic Sentry. So again, in a world where NATO is actually now getting more flexible because it has to due to the threat, again, the USP of the GEF is slightly diminished. And I call it a bit about use it or you lose it. You either use the benefits that you have, or the environment, the other organizations are going to realize their own gaps and deficiencies and sort of move into that way. So I think there's a lot now where, again, First Sea Lord Royal Navy might want to take Jeff back to basics and actually build it up again, almost from a defence framework, and say, well, if the political layer is too difficult, if that's too ambitious, if the UK is not going to invest in that, then it can at least be a proper military framework looking at Northern Europe, which is really where the threat from Russia emanates.
So let's go back to 2024 when the JEF didn't respond, right? And Baltic Sentry got stood up. Is this a political problem? Is it a NATO JEF problem? Is it an operational problem, military one? Or was it just simply not required?
So I think the main political military problem in the region is that the JEF, again, has never been able to explain how it gets its legitimacy to operate fully in the Baltic with Germany and Poland not as members. You have this sort of JEF plus idea that is sort of enhanced partnerships, plug and play, and that works again at a JEF NATO level. But ultimately, it's quite difficult for the UK to then start to lead in those areas. So I think there's a bit of reluctance. And then also I think there's a capability issue because, for the UK to really cohere and have credibility in the AOR, I mean, it's the North Atlantic, including the Arctic, the High North, and the Baltic Sea. That's pretty big to do when, as we've seen a lot of in the news now, mainly around sort of what's happening in the Middle East, is just fleet availability makes that almost impossible. And the credibility problem, the fact that the UK HMS Dragon was supposed to be commanding NATO's Standing Maritime Group 1 in the Baltic, and the UK is now having to do it from a German vessel. So I think there's those problems. And then I think there was just at the time some of those political issues, if a new government in doing the strategic defence review. So obviously JEF was part of that. And then actually the activities that you saw within the Baltic Sea were these incidents where undersea infrastructure targeted, which was actually, quite often it's by either Chinese or Hong Kong flagged vessels, not necessarily Russian, because actually if they were Russian flagged, it'd be easier to do something about it. And there's a position where the Yipeng 3 had done some damage and was in international waters. And actually it was a Danish and Swedish vessels that were sort of trying to maneuver around it, and then the decision to board potentially. And I argued at the time, well, if the Danes decide to board a Hong Kong flag, I mean, that's a huge diplomatic incident. That's what the Chinese are sort of relying on. Would it be too difficult for the Foreign Secretary or the Defence Secretary to stand up in Parliament, give the update and say that we support whatever the Danes will do? And ultimately they didn't on that front. But you're starting to see some other nations do those types of operations. And then you're seeing the UK not doing those types of operations. So again, there's a credibility issue there. And then I think broadly this year, the main credibility issue was very political in the sense of what was happening with Donald Trump designs on Greenland and the UK being very slow to support the Danes. Now, the Danes are like-minded. They are an ally. They're a group within the JEF. They were under our command in Afghanistan. I served with them as well. And then we're not going to talk or support them diplomatically as much as the Germans or the French, then you've again got a political credibility problem. So the political level is just not working at all. The UK hasn't gripped that and actually, I think, understood the potential value of the JEF. And that's why there's this potential drive to move it back to a military operational level construct where it can actually have some value.
Your arguments make absolute sense to me. And who wouldn't be leader of the UK's navies and not call on allies to do what you don't have the capacity to do yourself? Makes absolute sense. I am a little bemused, however, that the UK somehow found itself or pushed itself into this idea of commanding it. And I'm not sure what gives the UK the authority, the weight, the credibility to command. Sure, it's led in Afghanistan and it commanded international forces. It had a record of co-leading, perhaps with the French, although I'm not sure how much of that is true, in Libya in 2011, but I mean, it didn't go awfully well. The strategic outcomes for Afghanistan weren't great. Why would these other states just bow to the UK and go, yeah, no, absolutely right. You take command. That's your thing. The argument goes from Polish colleagues, the British way of doing it is from a British voice, you do the dying, we'll do the commanding. And it seems to be this thing that Britain is making itself out to be somehow better able to command than anyone else. How much is that sits behind it? How much is history? Where is the origins of this decision lie?
I mean, it comes from the period in 2014, and it's, I think, intimately intertwined with defence spending and sort of, again, credibility. But the issue is, so if you look at in 2014 and just on defence spending percentage metric, it's not the best percentage, it's not the best metric, but it's the one that NATO uses. The UK was the only one that met 2% back in 2014, which became the NATO target at the Wales summit that year. Now, fast forward to 26. So we're now 9th of 10 within the GEF on that metric. And I'd argue the only reason that we're probably not 10 is because Iceland doesn't have a military. So it's always going to be 10th in that grouping. And this is, I think, the issue with the GEF, that the reason it worked, or one of the reasons it worked, again, the USP, was that there was a clear framework lead, which was the UK. Now, if you look at a variety of other European security arrangements, if you ever have, say, the UK, France, or Germany, that sort of peer grouping, it doesn't really work because it's not as clear how you want the framework to go. I mean, the Germans actually, because the GEF is a NATO framework nations concept, and there were 3 of them. And for example, the German one started off as about 8 nations, but the Germans have this desire to just multilateralize everything. So they have, I think there's about 22, 23 members now. So it's basically just an equivalent of the EDA. And it's one of the reasons that the Germans, there's a huge reluctance to open GEF membership to Germany because they feel that they'll just sort of, again, keep it going and you'll lose that flexibility. But the point was GEF worked because the UK was in the lead. The problem is, because of the security environment, the UK has basically stood still and all other nations have just pushed way ahead. Partly because obviously a lower baseline, I understand that. But, I think the Lithuanians are leading, or back a couple of years ago when I wrote my big paper on GEF, their increase in defence expenditure was 327%, the highest of NATO. So all of these other countries are getting more serious about defence. They're getting more serious about the Russian threat. UK isn't. So this is where now I think there's that rebalancing where there are these questions in GEF members and non-GEF members as well to say, why is the UK leading this? I think the issues surrounding your HMS Dragon, I mean, these things are really hurting UK credibility. And it's not like you could come up with other arrangements. I mean, there's about 4 people full-time on GEF in Standing Joint Force Headquarters. There's 3 in the MOD. So, less than 10 full-time people on GEF. Standing Joint Force Headquarters also has the now CJF, which is the UK, France, and also potentially global operational commitment as well. But whereas I think the GEF is moving to and could be, I mean, the whole point is if you're cohering GEF C2, or the GEF is cohering basically national plans, then the GEF doesn't actually need to do that much of the command as we see the current threat, because why would you mess with what the Norwegians currently have or the Swedes or the Finns? It's about that coherence, getting more out of it. The issue is, again, that the GEF has sort of largely forgotten is when they signed the combined Memorandum of Understanding in 2018, which was a bit of a stepping stone leap in terms of what the GEF's abilities were. The ambition was for a deployment of 10,000, and it's never been mentioned since. So again, I always ask, is that still an ambition? Where are we going to this? Because the issue that you all know very well in European security and all of these frameworks, initiatives, etc., is it's only one set of forces. So some can be dual, triple-hatted. And I think what I pick up again from the members now is this real kind of worry on that side of the UK, who's saying, well, hang on. So if you're going to go and command an operation, a multinational force Ukraine, you might then also go do something to reopen the strait. I mean, you're just taking combat capability away from the GEF area of operations. But that said, the UK still has that ability to potentially do things at scale if it chooses to do so. But my argument's always been it can't do everything. So the UK, if you are going to focus now on, for example, the North, that is pretty much all we can do based on our current capability profile. And the opportunity is there because wider changes in NATO, UK now has command of Norfolk. So we're basically on the hook for C2 for NATO's regional plan Northwest. So if you're actually on the hook at that top level, then everything should filter down, and the common sort of organizing principle for that should be UK C2. Great, that makes sense. But then you had this chief of the defence staff this year in front of the House of Commons Defence Committee confirming that we don't have a national defence plan yet. So it's weird that we're not then doing Article 3, but we think that we can do that sort of command layer. And I think you're absolutely right that for Nordic and Baltic states, we supplied the troops and you supplied the connectivity and the C2 maturity. I mean, that's not a great deal for our allies, I don't think.
Is there something to be said about this belief that the UK can command and has experience of commanding at a level that others don't? So, for example, you wouldn't imagine that the Estonians would offer themselves up to command Swedish and Finnish forces, let alone the Norwegians. And the UK does have experience of working within large, usually American headquarters that deal with, for example, maritime task groups of 50, 60 platforms at once, dealing with the logistics resupply. So they have some experience of this stuff that others don't. Do you reckon that gives additional credibility to the sort of UK claiming position of command? Or have we moved so far along from Libya, Afghanistan, UK withdrawal effectively from the Middle East, that these claims really no longer hold water in the eyes of allies?
I think they still do. And one of the reasons, so the first thing I did after I got back from SHAPE in 2014 was actually deploy as a infantry intelligence officer on one of the reassurance exercises that I had set up while I was in a 4-star headquarters into Latvia. And before it was all defense and deterrence and be built up, it was about reassurance. And the view was, well, we'll go and exercise. This is before the enhanced forward presence for land forces was set up. And it was about reassurance. It's about reassuring the Latvians principally. So we went on this week-long exercise. And I had no reassurance in the Latvians and their C2 capability and a variety of allies, because it was just completely different. Because again, we had just done divisional level in Iraq, brigade level in Helmand, and we were just so much better. But that gap has closed. And what particularly the Baltic states are doing, they're pretty much completely integrating as the 3 Baltic states plus Poland, etc. So I think the question mark is more like, is it a large land force that the JEF is going to be? Probably not. Is it more maritime task force that can do a variety of tasks? Probably. But whether that actually needs to happen at that whole JEF 10 member, it's not really that clear. And actually, there's areas whereby, so for example, anti-submarine warfare that we run as the trilateral between the US, Norway, and the UK. Geographically, that makes sense. Adding lots of other countries into that. And also, you're starting to see a bit more of a Baltic versus sort of Nordic split, because actually, what you might need to do in the Baltic Sea region is completely different to what you may need to do in the High North. Now that the Germans have the maritime component command for the Baltic as well, it makes far more sense for the Germans to take a bit of a lead in the Baltic. So, I've articulated that as the UK should push where its capabilities are required the most in terms of the High North, North Sea, North Atlantic, which is, again, what's happening under the current Royal Navy. Probably do less in the Baltic because, A, the Germans are there, and B, you now have Baltic sentry. That's a bit difficult, obviously, for the Baltic states because they'd still want the UK in there. But the UK is already there due to Cabrit and Forward Land Force in Estonia. So you can sort of do less possibly in the maritime, and that's more where the land is. But also, I think on this C2 element, if you look at now again, UK has Norfolk. That's not just the commander and his MA and whoever it is. You've got to start to push a lot of UK personnel over there to give it that sort of flavour. You then have the ARC, Allied Response Force, in Gloucester. That's a significant commitment, mainly UK. You then have Standing Joint Force Headquarters, 2-star. Again, lots of UK commitments. So you're starting to see quite a lot of layered headquarters And I think when we talk about headquarters, everyone just assumes it's like loads of connections of wires in certain buildings. I mean, it's not, it's people. Again, does the UK have enough people suitably trained to be on staff and command in all of those areas, which are pretty much all looking at Europe as well? And then just that, and now we've got an additional 3-star headquarters to potentially do operations in Ukraine, which is currently in Paris, but it comes over because it's a rotating one to London this year. Again, do we need all of those separate headquarters at separate flag levels, all looking at the same geography? I don't think so. And I just don't think we have the personnel to do so either.
Is it a political problem over prioritisation? I mean, you've listed a whole myriad of command commitments that the UK has there. You and I both know that no matter how big a military, you're really going to have problems finding the right people to command those, given the rotations that militaries look at, rotating a commander every 15 months, 2 years at a max, generating those people, the supporting effort that sits beneath them. You might be able to teach the processes. But is there a requirement for political leaders in the UK to say, okay, here's our priorities. It's Norfolk, High North, Ukraine, and the Baltic. That would allow the military to do it more. But we're unlikely to see that, right? Even if you thought that was a good idea.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the problem with the UK has always been we start off at the global level and then even break it down. But even if you're looking at the Euro-Atlantic, I have a paper coming out, a RUSI paper for the FCDO on this, which will be out next week, actually, which I'm making the argument that if you look at what we are starting to say in terms of where the threat is principally to the UK homeland, well, that's all, again, the North, High North. That's the likely vector of attack, whether it be hybrid or conventional from the Russians. Then you've got where our interests lie, at that sort of GF bilateral layer. Again, it's the same area. And now, having Norfolk, NATO first, then that's exactly, again, where the UK should focus. So if it is about a choice, then it is almost sole focus now on sort of principally on the High North and then the connecting areas. So it is actually an opportunity that almost the choice has been made for us. But then the resourcing, again, the C2 then would have to match that eventuality. And I don't think it's necessarily, I understand from the UK position, you don't want to let other partners down, etc. But it's the one thing where NATO is now actually in a far better place than it has been in the last 30 years, because you have the regional plans. We know where we're going to fight. We know that the UK is not suddenly going to have to go to the Mediterranean, as an example. It's going to be in the north. So that's where we really do need to focus in on. So I think there's an element of freedom now that we have that hopefully the UK will align to that. I think Ukraine is a big distraction, and there's a question mark of supporting that as a coalition of the willing rather than a military multinational force, Ukraine within that. And then also the Middle East. I was in Tallinn this weekend. Estonians are really worried that we're going to start to pull out troops, etc., or just focus from Kabrit to put into other areas because we just don't have the forces. And I was trying to reassure them, saying, I really don't think that would happen. I think that's just something that people are saying, well, you don't have the numbers to do the other things. Where would they come from? Looking at Estonia as an option. But again, go back to that NATO first. Kabrit is the largest contingent of UK forces overseas now. It is the area where we are leading as the framework nation. Where the GEF might come in again is that you can cohere that as the UK with your capabilities, with C2 specialisms, maturity, confidence, and actually start to make a bit of a difference. But I think you're absolutely right, not just in terms of the Royal Navy hybrid navies concept. You're obviously going to go hybrid because you don't have the conventional capabilities. But equally, in terms of building those up, if you can do as much as you can with allies, well, it's just additional capability layer. So I think we're now in a position as the UK is, Northern Navies, it's got to succeed, because if it doesn't, then the GEF credibility and UK credibility in terms of leadership at the NATO layer and also in the North is really on the line.
Two things I want to just hit before, we're talking about C2, we can't not talk about this. The first one is selection of Northwood as the headquarters, which for UK in C2 terms, with all the expertise, the 15, 16 command responsibilities that now sit at Northwood. This seems like the right place to put it for the expertise, but it does sort of put all your eggs in one basket. It also doesn't have the geographic expertise that you might want if you're in Bodo or Trondheim or somewhere that really is in the high north that experiences it. So the selection of that as its geographic location, I was wondering about. And the second point I want to get to probably after that point is about the command systems they want to use. But let's do the geography first, and then I'll get to command systems.
I think Northwood was, I mean, it made sense just in terms of the size, what it has, and also maritime command at a NATO level being there as well, plus one of the new sort of setups for undersea critical infrastructure at the NATO level there as well. So co-location, slight change now in terms of the NATO structures changing. So the US now running MARCOM. But I mean, again, when you look at it from a UK-US bilateral there, although that command has changed, there's going to be a lot of synergies. So I think geographically, it is right. And then what the JEF has done in the last couple of years on its sort of large yearly exercises is testing C2 nodes and their deployability. So they have done that in Iceland, in Lithuania as well. So that ability to go and just put a C2 node in. Now, I don't know if it's just about putting another C2 node in, which is in the geography. That is helpful. It would also be very helpful from a UK NATO standpoint to try and bridge that gap between Norfolk and Europe because of the time zone difference. So if you're trying to run a crisis operation there, then actually having something on this side of the Atlantic is useful. But I don't see it necessarily as a separate sort of UK-led C2 node. I think it's actually just testing the flexibility of the UK to surge into an area. So again, if the operation or the threat is around the North Sea, the Norwegian Sea, the ability to just throw UK people at a problem and actually integrate into the Norwegian system is probably a better way to go. Now, Bodo is also established with the new KOC, where you have these 250 Nordic fighters under a single command at a NATO layer as well, which is significant because it's a European capability. It doesn't need the US. Why would the UK suddenly go in and potentially try and take that over and do our thing? Don't mess with that. But there are certain areas where it'd be great if the UK could just surge capability from Standing Joint Force headquarters, plug in, and just give that sort of initial boost to what might be required in a crisis. And quite often these crises, they happen quite often. They start to sort of come up and then they start to stabilize and come down. But for that particular moment, if the UK could support other nations, I think that that's far better than us saying we're going to put a UK command into this place or that place and set it up. And I think it would be quite easy to do considering that we've been testing it for a number of years.
I mean, it leads us on quite nicely to talk about the system of command. What I was fascinated about in the announcement notes that came out from General Gwyn Jenkins of the Royal Navy, it says that the UK will command using the C2 tools that partners already have in place. Now, I found that fascinating because the UK is not really playing on those systems. The UK seems to be favouring the US one instead, the Maven Smart system that the US is sort of heavily invested in and all the rest of that. There is a distinct difference between that and the European offerings. What do you think the outcome is going to be here? Because in balancing integration with US headquarters, calling on that second line support, but commanding this Northern Group Initiative, the JEF, as it's said on the command systems already exist, as you've said, with the command systems that are used across, for example, air forces, KOCs, maritime operations centres, they are distinctly different. Do you see this being an important thing? I mean, I was amazed that it came out in the written statement and the answer to questions that sort of came out. It seemed to be quite important, the point the UK was making, but I couldn't really figure why it was.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of times where we've potentially, again, looked towards the US without that European redundancy. I think it really has to be as highly integrated with the Europeans as possible. Otherwise, we're effectively coming up with a technical solution which will reinforce potential allied perceptions about our ability to actually do this in terms of command. And again, the JEF, this coherence, this Article 3 position, you have to be able to let whichever nation is sort of leading on it initially with UK support, really hold the ball on it. So the ability to do that is, I think, really important. And also the geopolitical environment is making that far more important because, again, the JEF is a European construct. It doesn't need the US. It has JEFnet, it has rudimentary secure comms, obviously not as good as NATO, but it is a sort of system that the UK can talk to allies without the US present if required at a secure level. And those things really need to be built on. And I am a little wary about, I don't know if it's possible to do both, for example. But again, it's splitting the UK between the US requirements, which is still important in that area from a NATO level, even a bilateral level, with the Second Fleet, for example, up in the Arctic. But the UK cannot achieve its stated ambitions for JEF and the Northern Navies without that ability to be really in sync with the JEF. Because I think, again, there's two issues surrounding the JEF. And what we're talking about at the moment is mainly on the sort of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance side. There's this big area of operations. We've got to see all of this nefarious activity, which is increasing. Great. That's also what Nordic Warden was there to do, so the Palantir system, to be able to sort of queue on to vessels of interest. But once you've identified that something's going wrong, you've got to do something about it, the interdiction, the action layer, and that requires the capability to do so. And this is where I've been pretty annoyed again about sort of the UK's handling of this at a JEF level. So in March, the Prime Minister made this speech to say, Shadow Fleet vessels, we're going to start to clamp down on that. And everyone goes, that's great. You then have a publicised meeting of JEF Attorneys General to get the legal standpoint out. And you're like, great. And as you and I know, if you're going to get the cameras out for a meeting, all the actual details already been worked out. They might sign it there, but it's been staffed prior. And that's a lot of effort. So we do that. And then over 100 vessels have now transited in UK waters that could have been the targets to do UK interdiction, to again prove that concept, to build on, to get that confidence level, again, for allies to say the UK is with you. Nothing. Whereas the Finns first boarded the Lion S a year and a half ago, the Swedes have boarded, and the Belgians have boarded. When you're operationally behind the Belgians as the UK on these types of things, that is difficult. And again, I think that might sound a bit harsh, but the reason that I'm saying it in that way is, you went to the whole point of getting the political kudos of saying we're doing something. You got the attorneys general round you made it public, and now you haven't backed that up operationally. So that's where I think the challenge is with the First Sea Lord and what he wants to do with this Northern Navies concept. It can't just be a concept. It's got to show its value pretty quickly, because otherwise it gets into, again, a bit of a delay of the Atlantic Bastion, strike and shield, etc., which is, we get the concept, where's the money, where's the capability, when's it going to be operational? So I think what the UK needs to do now in regard to, NATO commitments, but also JEF, is momentum. You've got to get those quick wins. You've got to show capability. You've got to show that the UK value here is still there, and keep adding on to that. And ultimately, this is not an internal discussion about just showing that the UK can do it in JEF. Well, you've also got to push back against the Russians, and you've got to do it to show them that you can't do this. And what you're actually starting to see now is the Russians went from deniability for the Shadow Fleet. They're now actually going to overt military support for some of these vessels. So it actually makes the job a lot harder. But it is an area whereby if the JEF can get to that point where you are having this Northern Navies concept, not just for surveillance of all of the nefarious activity that's been happening, but you're actually responding to that, and you are punishing and hurting the Russians, not just in that area, but also the war effort into Ukraine. That's pretty important for all individual members, plus NATO, and also Europe. That's where we need to get to. The question mark is, can we get there, and can we get there quick enough?
Ed, a brilliant explanation. Thanks for taking the time to come on the show. We'll see where this topic goes, but on that final point from you, momentum equals credibility. It's not credibility with the UK public, but credibility in the eyes of allies and adversaries. Really important. Over the summer of 2026, we're going to run a mini-series of this show looking specifically of the future of US command and control. Not simply going over JADC2 or CJADC2 or whatever other acronym that comes up with, but rather by talking with each fighting service of the US military. Hold on to your hats for a bit of a roller coaster as the US Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines and Coast Guard, as well as a special episode on the future of battlefield health and how C2 of that joint function fits in as well. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR Citaware suite.
We hope you enjoy this show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do hit the like or subscribe buttons. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.